Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight to discuss this very timely issue, what states are getting right in terms of disclosure of independent expenditures. We have a great panel set up with both state and national experts on campaign finance. So we will be hearing from Elizabeth Shimmick from the Campaign Legal Center, who is based in Wisconsin, but their office is in Washington. Jarek DeMarinis, and Alan Norfleet from the Maryland Office of Elections. We call it the Department of Elections, so I always get mixed up. And we're really delighted to have Terry Goddard, former Attorney General of Arizona, the godfather of Proposition 211, which was a ballot initiative introduced, I think it was 2022, but he can clarify. It was focusing on disclosure of independent expenditures. I am Nancy Morgan, a coordinator of Big Money Out. It's an all-volunteer, nonpartisan group advocating for getting big money out of politics. We work with American Promise, which is a national organization in support of an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would allow the states and Congress to regain their rights after 50, 60 years. Well, the Supreme Court has taken outweigh the ability to regulate election spending, as well as pressuring for campaign finance reform in Virginia, which it's surprising for many of us that we're a state ranked 46 out of 50 by the Coalition for Integrity and based on indicators of transparency and accountability to its citizens. So I think that most Americans, especially at this time where a lot of us are right across from DC, are frustrated by the influence of large donors in our elections and public policies. So it's important to learn from practices from states around the country as they introduce innovative reform. And a colleague of mine, Karen Greenaway, will be monitoring the chat. So please put in, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and indicate who they're directed at. No, I think we just want to start, and we're going to ask Elizabeth Shimmick from the Campaign Legal Center to sort of set the stage for our discussion by presenting an overview of constitutional framework for disclosure laws. And I just want to thank the Campaign Legal Center because really it is a organization that really, and Elizabeth, one of the members, that focuses on helping states in terms of advocates for campaign finance and building up our knowledge on how to effectively introduce legislation on a state level. So Elizabeth, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's so good to be here today. I hope you'll bear with me as I get the screen sharing going. So just 1 second. All right. So as Nancy mentioned, my name is Beth Shimmick. I work as Senior Legal Counsel for Campaign Finance with Campaign Legal Center. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and we work to advance democracy through law in 4 different issue areas, one of which is campaign finance. So most of my work is working with state and local advocates across the country to develop better, stronger campaign finance laws. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the constitutional foundation of transparency in state campaign finance, and then some of the different ways that states address transparency and disclosure across the country, just to set the stage a little bit for the conversation that we'll be having with Jared and Alan and Terry. So just to kick things off, I like to start with why transparency in election spending is important. Maybe that's a little elementary, but I think it's good to know that transparency empowers. When we have a transparent political spending system, citizens can effectively participate in the democratic process. Voters get to know who is trying to influence elections and who supports or opposes particular candidates in their spending. It allows citizens to hold elected officials accountable. When someone's spending a lot of money to get an official elected and then an official makes different decisions in office, it's really helpful to know as you're assessing someone's performance as your legislator. And then transparency also helps enforcement agencies and watchdog groups to detect violations of related laws, like bans on foreign interference and foreign spending in our elections, and coordination laws. So as we move into this conversation, I think it's really helpful to have some shared definitions, some terms to know, because I know we all come to this conversation with different levels of expertise, and I'm an attorney, so I tend to fall into lingo pretty easily. So I have 4 definitions that I think will be helpful as foundations here. The first is independent expenditures. People often also call that independent spending. So election-related expenditures by non-candidate groups, which are not coordinated, working together with a candidate or a ballot measure campaign. The second is dark money. I think we use the words dark money a lot. That's secret spending in elections by wealthy special interests that are not subject to disclosure or are subject to very limited disclosure. That darkness is that we don't know where the money's coming from. The third is express advocacy. These are political communications that use words such as vote for, elect, support, the opposites of those, vote against, don't support, regarding candidates or ballot measures. And finally, electioneering communications. So this is a category of paid communications that reference a clearly identified candidate, and it takes place in a short window before an election. At the federal level, that is 30 days before a primary, 60 days before a general. Different states have different definitions if they regulate electioneering communications. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the core essential cases in campaign finance disclosure jurisprudence. We're not going to get deep into all of the cases that are out there. I'm a lawyer. I could talk forever, and that's going to be really boring for everyone. But we'll talk about the 3 kind of key cases to know as a foundation. So the first is Buckley v. Vallejo from 1976. This case decided that the government has key interests in regulating campaign transparency. And those 2 key interests are providing the electorate with information about where political campaign money comes from and how it's spent, which allows voters to make informed choices. The second is preventing corruption and the appearance of corruption in our political system. The next case is McConnell v. FEC. This is more than 20 years old now. He's still, giving me a little heart attack when I say that. From 2003, McConnell required disclosure of sources of funding behind those electioneering communications we just talked about. They determined that it is constitutional because disclosures do not prevent anyone from speaking and impose no ceiling on campaign-related activities. That means that it is totally okay to say, hey, for electioneering communications, you need to have paid for by Americans for America. That doesn't stop someone from running their ad. It's just information that the public has a right to know. The third case, which I think we're all, very familiar with, now 15 years old, Citizens United v. FEC. I think most of us are familiar with it as the case that opened the floodgates to corporate spending, unlimited outside spending in our elections. But there's actually another part of the case that is really important to transparency and disclosure. Citizens United actually upheld federal transparency requirements for corporate and union spending. It held that disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to that corporate speech, that big spending, in the proper way. This transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions. So that was an 8-to-1 portion of that decision. So when we're thinking about these foundations, it's also helpful to know a little bit about how different states are approaching disclosure. So there are 3 key considerations when you're looking at disclosure laws in the states. The first question is, what spending is subject to disclosure? The second is where the money is coming from. And the third is the bucket that I like to call ensuring effective disclosure, making sure that it's really actually useful when you get that information. So that first question is, what spending is regulated? What spending is subject to disclosure? So for example, in Virginia, currently only express advocacy, those magic words, are subject to disclosure laws. But there's a much broader universe of disclosure depending on the state that you look at. There are a lot of different levers states choose to use when they're deciding what spending is subject to disclosure. So for example, some states regulate what we call PASO communications. These are paid communications that promote, attack, support, or oppose a clearly identified candidate. And this is what states like Arizona does for big spending, as in Prop 211. States like Maine and Hawaii also have similar laws that look at more than just those kind of magic words in express advocacy. There are also states that regulate electioneering communications. It's the federal government does this. Many states Like I said, those are those communications that include a clearly identified candidate in that short window before an election that are really meant to influence your opinion. You might see, say, at the federal level, 28 days before the election, call Representative Shimmick and let her know that we think schools need more money. It's not immediately an election ad, but it's designed to influence how you think about that candidate. The final area that I'd like to touch on is digital ad disclosure. We know digital ads have become a much bigger part of our electoral world, but I think a lot of folks are surprised to find out that not every state regulates digital ads like they regulate the ads you see on your TV or get in your mailbox. So lots of states are taking on different innovative approaches to include digital ads in their disclosure regimes. And some states are as innovative as New York or cities like Los Angeles and are actually doing digital ad archives where independent spenders have to submit the ads that they run so everyone can see them. Because I know, like, my husband and I get totally different ads based on our demographics, and sometimes vote the exact same candidate on the exact same night. It's helpful for democratic discourse to know. So that's kind of questions about what spending falls under disclosure that states are making decisions about. The second area is those sources of that spending. So where is the money coming from? Not just what ads, but what money. So for example, Virginia currently doesn't require disclosure of the sources of funds spent independently. It's just this ad was funded by Americans for America, but there's not any reporting about where Americans for America got their money. So many states require disclosure of contributors to one extent or another. The majority of states at least require disclosing the immediate donors to that spender. So you might have a report that says, Americans for America got money above a certain threshold, say $50, from 200 different people. And they also spent that money on ads. There are other states that go farther with what we call original source or disclose style laws. These are two different styles that look not just at the immediate funder behind a group spending, but they actually look back all the way through the chain. If money is being passed along from group to group, intermediary to intermediary, back to the person who originally earned that money or the business that originally earned that money. And there are reporting mechanisms that allow you to really trace that chain and see where that money came from. So there are a number of states that actually have laws that try to do this, including Arizona, Alaska, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, among others. So a couple of other ways states choose to look at the sources of spending and help share that information with the public is through disclaimers. I think a lot of people are familiar with it. I've already referenced it a number of times today, but disclaimers, those on-ad statements about where the money is coming from or who's spending, are an instantaneous source of campaign finance information for the public. It makes that immediately available to the voters. So for example, Virginia requires basic paid for by on-ad disclaimers for print, TV, and many digital and electronic ads. Other states go a little bit farther and they have top donor disclaimers. So these statements list not only who's spending, but also the biggest donors behind that group or the donors behind that particular ad. Often that's the top 3 donors. So you'll see that in states like Arizona and Alaska and Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Washington. But there are other states, other communities that also have these rules. So the final bucket is ensuring effective disclosure. So this is looking at ways to make sure that the information that is disclosed is actually useful and relevant. It's important to narrowly tailor your laws. That's the legal way of saying make sure there's a fit between the public interest that disclosure serves and the disclosure requirements so that laws are defensible in case of legal challenges. The second piece of ensuring effective disclosure is making sure that there are appropriate thresholds. Focus on the significant sources of outside election spending and the significant sources of money flowing to them, as opposed to, every donor who gives $25. The final pieces of that, I would say, are making sure that there's sufficient funding and staffing for the agency or the body that's actually tasked with implementation and enforcement, so that the law can be implemented and enforced effectively, and public participation. It's really important that the public is looking at these reports as engaging with the information. That includes watchdog groups and grassroots groups who help to hold spenders accountable. So these are all of the bits and pieces that I think are really important when we look at that constitutional foundation down to all the different ways that states are taking to address independent spending. With that, I'll hand it back to Nancy.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was very helpful. What I'm going to ask is, and you mentioned the Virginia laws within your presentation. I'm going to ask my colleague Karen Greenaway to just give us a brief overview of what, over the last 8 years, we've been looking at trying to introduce limits on campaign finance, on disclosure, on effective oversight. Karen, you want to just give us a brief overview of some of the bills that have been introduced? None of them have been passed, but specifically focuses on independent expenditures, and that sets the tone for more details on what states are doing on this issue, as Elizabeth mentioned.
Yeah, so for the last 8 years, thank you all for coming tonight. What we have focused on as an organization, and as Nancy emphasized, we are an all volunteer organization, is comprehensive campaign finance reform. And the reason we focused on comprehensive campaign finance reform is because basically Virginia is what we define as a pay-to-play state. In other words, you can give as much money to whomever you want to give it to. And up until this last legislative session, the person who received that money as a candidate could spend it on whatever they wanted to spend it on, including themselves and their family. So one of the early bills that we have pushed very hard to get passed was a prohibition against personal use, because Virginia was one of only 2 states that allowed you, like you said, to use your campaign funds any way that you wanted to spend them. The other issues that we have supported are bills that relate to limits. So prohibiting, so limiting how much an individual, a business could give to a particular campaign. Right now, we have no limits. For focusing on bills related to ethics, which is a little bit complicated, but specifically it relates to conflict of interest laws, and making sure that people who are elected are making decisions for the Commonwealth or for their community and not based upon their own personal financial interest. And then, of course, we have focused on these various disclosure bills, which kind of go into a few buckets. In this past legislative session, we supported enhanced disclosure for any entity making independent expenditures. As Beth already said, in Virginia, we only focus on direct contributions. We wanted to try to start to capture, like Arizona and Maryland, ways that indirect contributions were coming in, or that non-transparent entities were making donations. We also wanted to focus on trying to get behind, campaign coordination, with independent expenditure entities, which is not supposed to happen, but we've discovered that actually it does happen in Virginia, which is prohibited in every other state. And then finally, we focused on those electioneering communications and trying to get more like Virginia. In fact, the law that we championed was based on Arizona's Proposition 211 law that we will hear, or Arizona's Proposition 211 that we will hear about, because we wanted to know who are these people who are spending so much money for these incredibly expensive advertisements that should start to overwhelm us, any day now, going into the next election. And then finally, there was a disclosure bill related to, people who are creating advertisements using AI and not having the real person who they're targeting or supporting actually a part of the advertisement. And so essentially falsely representing, the advertisement is something that was agreed to by the candidate or used the candidate's image, when in fact the candidate did not either agree to or was not supportive of the ad. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the bills. The last one I would say is that we have patterned on Connecticut and New York, a public financing of election bills. It's really worked well in these states. And I think we're seeing it now in the mayor's race in New York as well, as a number of candidates are using public financing. And with that public financing goes very strict rules about disclosing not only where, the original sources of funds, but how you're actually spending the funds, which Virginia also is very lax on that part of campaign finance as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. That was great. And in fact, also this was the first year that they've authorized audits or reviews for campaign finance. And they just did a January 1st report, which basically shows it, well, because our Department of Elections has no oversight and regulatory oversight in terms of taking any action, enforcement action. So we're sort of at a very low learning curve. And that's why I'm really excited to have Terry and Alan. Jared isn't here yet, I don't think. Alan, you want to go first? You want me to have Terry go first?
Terry, please go first.
Okay, so we're really happy to have Terry Goddard. We've been watching the evolution of this Prop 2011, which is being litigated as we speak. I think that Campaign Finance's Campaign Legal Center is involved in that. But it's an example of how the public, 80% of the public, 90% of the public, irrespective of parties, believe that large donors have too much influence and we need more transparency in terms of disclosure. So we're really happy to have Terry. He was, as I mentioned, the godfather of this Prop 2011. He was also the former Attorney General of Arizona. So Terry, we're very happy to have you here. And if you could just give us an overview of Prop 2211 and where you are now in terms of implementing the law.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you all for your interest in stopping dark money, which is, I think, a coalescing issue across this country. We had a long saga in Arizona. I won't go into all the details, but because we are allowed to direct initiatives, our first effort was in 2016. After just a horrendous effort where dark money basically elected 2 members of our Corporation Commission, which regulates utilities rates. And they managed, the local utility secretly was able to finance 2 candidates who got elected and who promptly voted for higher utility rates and electricity. That was sort of the warning cry that said, we're being hurt by dark money. We individuals are getting hit in the pocketbook. It's not just corrupt and corrupting. It's making our lives miserable. So that was the clarion call in 2014, led to an initiative measure that I supported in 2016. It failed for lack of funds. The main person that was behind us actually sheepishly committed that he and his organization actually used dark money and they weren't going to finance an effort to do away with it. So that was a little misnomer. But in 2018, we tried again, and in this case, we ran into a legal hurdle, just a few thousand signatures short. In 2020, COVID intervened, and we were unable to continue collecting signatures. 2022, we finally got on the ballot, got over the opposition, and were resoundingly supported by Arizona electorate without regard to partisan. It was a 72% margin of victory. And I think it would have been higher than that, except for some confusion in the way the ballot proposition was phrased. So it's now the law in Arizona as of December of 2022, has been implemented in the last election cycle, I think very successfully. But as you mentioned, Nancy, it is being challenged in court. The folks who support dark money are not a majority. I think we've proven that, but they are very well funded and they are absolutely tenacious. And I'd be happy if there's time to go into some of the legal charges that they've tried to bring. Every court in Arizona, both trial courts and appellate courts, have said that this is nonsense. They have there have been three different cases, 1 federal, 2 state, have all very successful for upholding full disclosure. So let me just say a little about what Prop 211, the new law in Arizona, does. And hopefully that'll invite some questions and some comments. It has a threshold. We didn't want to have every single contribution have to be disclosed simply from a paperwork perspective, if nothing else. So for local races, you have to reach a $25,000 expenditure for direct campaign communications level. And for statewide, it's $50,000. And we start our disclosures by individual or corporation at $5,000 at the original level. And Beth made this point, I thought, very well with her PowerPoints. We're one of the states that is trying to get to the original contributor. We recognize that the alphabet soup of phony 501c4s are deliberately intended to launder the funds so that the original contributor is not known. And they can be very deceptive about that. I, as you mentioned, was a prosecutor for many years, and one of our major prosecution targets were money launderers. Well, folks who use dark money are, although it's perfectly legal, they are in most states, they are money laundering. They are trying, as money launderers do, to disguise the actual source of the money. And there's a good reason for that. They're very sure that if that source is actually disclosed, that it will have an adverse effect on the voter. In the case I used a minute ago of our local beloved utility, if they'd known that those candidates were being supported by the utility who would gain from their votes on the commission, I don't believe the voters would have voted for them, but they didn't know. And as a result, they both got elected. It was a statewide election in Arizona. So we have some thresholds. We also have some provisions that were added, and I've got to express my great admiration and gratitude to the Campaign Legal Center. This is a group of extraordinary lawyers who operate throughout the country and have been invaluable to us, and I know to hundreds of other efforts to try to use local enthusiasm, such as you have in Virginia, and focus it so that it's not going to get thrown out because of any legal foibles or things that were missed. They have the playbook, they're very good at it, and so I have been a big beneficiary of campaign legal centers. And now with the challenges, they've been in the courtroom protecting what we got passed from the voters. And one point I'd like to make particularly is that we're very conscious that this was going to be challenged. And we wanted to be very clear that it was not going to be something that somebody could inadvertently stumble into having their name disclosed. And that we found throughout our campaigns was one of the main issues of controversy. They said, well, what if somebody gives to X, Y, and Z nonprofit? It's a 501c4, it has political actions, but they don't have any particular campaign in mind. And then a couple of years later, that same contribution gets used for a political ad and this person's name gets disclosed. And we think we've covered that in like 99% of the situations, because we make it clear in the proposition that if you have to say whether or not you want your name to be potentially disclosed as a contributor. And if you say you don't, it doesn't mean that your money doesn't go to that particular nonprofit. It just means it doesn't go to pay for political ads. And we thought that was a critical distinction. So we're not denying people the effort to use their money where their heart is, but we are saying if you want to put that money into a paid political advertisement, you need to tell the public who you are. And I think that's so critically important. It's one of the reasons this was so popular in Arizona, which is split right down the middle, as I know Virginia is, with conservative and Republican, conservative and Democrat, liberal and Republican voters. And yet 72% voted yes on this proposition. And our polling showed that we were well over 90% in terms of total support. This is popular, as James Carville said in a blog post that I was participating in. He says, in his inimitable Cajun way, this is just good politics, because American people believe in disclosure. They believe in fairness. They want to know who it is that's trying to sell them a bill of goods. And I can tell you, in 4 separate petition campaigns that I was involved in, and literally thousands of people that I asked for a signature, not one has ever said, "Oh, fool me. I don't want to know. I don't want to know who's behind this ad. I just make it a surprise," because folks do care. And it doesn't matter what your politics are or what your persuasion is. You need to know so you can cast a knowledgeable vote. Thanks a lot. And really thank you for your interest in this issue.
Thank you so much, Tara. Terry. All I can say is I wish Virginia were a ballot initiative state because, in fact, as I mentioned to you, I think in an email, we had 3 disclosure bills introduced, and we had them introduced a couple of years in a row. And we were, I think everybody was sort of horrified. We had the Americans for Prosperity came up. Of course, they're opposed to it, but then the ACLU came up and they were opposed to it. Somehow insinuated that there's not only that money is speech, but there's a constitutional right to anonymity. So it's a difficult issue, and it's always nice to hear from people like yourself on how to make the arguments in support of something that, even like Elizabeth said, there was an 8-1 ruling with Scalia waxing poetic about the importance on the voters' right to know. So thank you so much. And Karen is watching the chat. I want to move over to Maryland, which is not a ballot initiative state. Jared Demarinis is here. He had a hard time getting on, but we're happy to have him here. And congratulations, Jared was head of the campaign finance group, which Alan, his colleague, has taken over, and now he's the head of the Office of Elections. Jared, do you want to give us a sort of a background of the history of disclosure independent expenditures in Maryland?
Sure, and I apologize for not having my camera somewhat on. I don't understand what's going on. I have a brand new computer. Alan can attest to this. And somehow, somewhere along the line, I think I disabled the camera and have been just dealing with technical issues with, new apps and everything else. So I apologize for all that here. Not the best time probably to get a new computer, but so it's interesting about independent expenditures as something as we moved forward with it, because when I first entered the state of Maryland, they didn't have much on the books, and it was it was kind of also the laws were also being developed with the great overview from the CLC there, Elizabeth, that she gave with all the cases, going through them all. But overall, when we started to look at this, it's funny to say this, but there is a benefit to gerrymandering. All the problems become in the primary election, and so a lot of the independent expenditures that were being developed or thought about were not necessarily trying to effectuate the general election, but were more to effectuate primary voters and what was going on. And as such, a lot of the legislators wanted to know what was happening in the election that affected them the most. And basically, it wasn't a partisan issue. It became more of just who's trying to influence the election, and it became back to its altruistic, almost meaning, trying to see who effectuates voters. So as we were moving forward with these laws here and navigating these court cases, it was we had a lot of bipartisan support on this, because everyone wanted to know what outside influences were coming into their election to influence their voters. And I think we took a comprehensive approach to it, which was basically anybody who was going to try to come into this election, we wanted to make sure that they had the most knowledge, the voters had the most knowledge and be informed about the decisions while making them. So we made sure that we had independent expenditure laws that were just on the entities that were making independent expenditures, but going one level deep, making sure that as the court cases were appearing, we had other issues with super PACs, which were independent expenditure only political action committees, and making sure that the disclosure is timely, and also enforcement actions against them are significant. And this is the key, I think, with a lot of independent expenditures, that is the the cost of doing business. When you're talking about millions of dollars in political ads that are being run outside your state and trying to influence voters in your state, the enforcement mechanisms get difficult for state officials to go after them because the campaign treasurer or the chair that is authorizing this is outside the state. So you had to whether you have to serve them to come into the state for any sort of enforcement actions, you have to kind of wade through all this as well. So the penalty for non-compliance has to be something of I would say, a deterring factor when crafting legislation. And our factor was it's $1,000 a day, or 10% of the expenditure that was not reported timely, whichever is greater. So, I mean, some of these penalties can rack up to the tens of thousands of dollars really fast, or even the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But usually you have to, it's tough because then you're going after them after the fact. But once you go after one bad actor in these situations here, you create I would say a floor, and also that uh, a a belief that yes, you might be able to skirt it during the election, but you're not going to skirt it forever, and we will get you eventually. And that's important as a deterring factor to ensure compliance as we move forward in these situations here. So that's kind of like the overall picture for how it kind of started, what's going on. And I think the other part too, which is this, that outside independent expenditures have only been increasing in these areas here. And it becomes a sad commentary that, as people run for all offices, individuals are not even considered serious unless they have some sort of outside group that backs them in these manners as well.
Thanks, Jared. That was really very informative. I'm going to just pass it over to Alan now, and just ask him, because one of the issues that always comes up in Virginia, and this relates to what Terry said on how you establish the thresholds, is like how do independent expenditure, when they make an expenditure, how do they report, and what is the mechanism for documenting that? I know because Karen Greenaway didn't say this, but it was only last year that we actually passed a bill to have electronic filing reporting by IEs. They were expected to fax in their their documents. So everything, you get these PDF files, and nobody really knew how to access the information. So Alan, can you talk about a little bit about your system and how you document, and even about the threshold issue, which I think is really important in getting traction for a bill, because you don't want to discourage small 501c nonprofits who aren't actually trying to do big influencing elections. How do you do that?
Sure. So our current system MD Chris, it's an electronic database. If once you spend $5,000 in independent expenditures, you have to register in MD Chris. And after that, it's every $10,000 spent in independent expenditures, you have to file a new 48-hour report. So again, due after 48 hours of the expenditure. So it it's pretty strict. I mean, it's a very short turnaround, and the beauty of that is that citizens of Maryland can go to that website and see within a very short period the large expenditures that are happening for TV, radio ads, those kind of things. So it's kind of like an instant disclosure system. And I will say our system is quite old right now. MD Chris is from 2012, but be on the lookout. November, our new system will disclose independent expenditures a little more vibrantly, and it'll show like the top spending of IEs and in the state. And in addition, when you go log into a candidate, you'll be able to see who's spending on behalf of, in support or opposing independent expenditures for a candidate. So I think that'll be another helpful tool I think for Maryland citizens to see who's spending in support or against a candidate.
Just a question then, it's, how do you know, how deep do you go in terms of who is actually funding the independent expenditures? I didn't get that from Jarrett, for example. If I have a LLC, Virginia Grandmothers Who Love Rainbows and Puppies, do you, I have to file more information than that?
Well, the disclosure reports that has you can enter a contribution and an expenditure. So if there's a contribution linked to that independent expenditure, it has to be disclosed. So if you had a $250,000 union treasury, payment for an independent expenditure, it would be filed with that disclosure report. And Jared and I were talking earlier, another way we can capture that is we have an entity called participating organizations. And that's another way we can, if a 501c4 makes a contribution to a super PAC or an independent expenditure committee, they have to report that after making $6,000 or more. Then they have to file a report every $10,000 too. So we have multiple ways we kind of capture these entities and their spending in our state.
Okay, well, thank you. Karen, can I go over to you? I notice there aren't any really questions in the chat, but I'm sure that you have some questions.
Sure. I mean, happy to answer any questions. I mean, I guess the thing is right now, independent expenditures are just kind of like there, and we have to kind of deal with them in a way that allows for. I mean, I just don't think that they're going away anytime soon with the constitutional makeup of the Supreme Court. But I think that what you have to always make sure about is having enough disclosure, timely disclosure elements of it, and we, as Elizabeth mentioned, like those independent disclosure ads as well, which were for online databases. Ours was kind of struck down a little bit with the court not wanting the online entities to have the libraries there. But I think that's kind of where everything is heading and how we have to proceed, because I don't think that you can put any limits on this, and I don't think that there's going to be. I think anytime you'd have a limit on any sort of activity in this day and age here is going to be constitutionally suspect at this point.
Karen, Greenaway, do you have?
So we have a question in the chat from Wes, and I'm gonna send this over to Beth. How does this apply? And I'm going to assume the laws that have been passed related to disclosure to fiscally sponsored organizations such as the 1630 Fund or Arabella Advisors.
Thanks for the question, Karen. I assume we're talking about states like Arizona that have traceback or disclosed style kind of deeper disclosure levels than what you might see in the average state. I see Wes says yes. So some of this depends on how the state law is structured. Based on, say, Arizona's statutes for the Voters' Right to Know Act, Prop 211, the spender has to, oh, sorry, there's another question coming up. The spender needs to disclose the original sources of funds behind the money that they're spending. So when they receive a donation from an organization that might pass along funds received from someone else, that organization has the option to opt out their spending or the money they've given from political spending and have it only go toward non-political purposes, as Terry already mentioned, or give permission for that money to be spent on political spending. And if they're going to give that permission, they have to disclose the original sources of the funds that they received, or say, you know, who had passed it along, so that you can keep going back to look at it. So, you know, if there's an advised fund that has collected money from donors, then I would assume, and, you know, I think this would very much depend on the facts and the statute in a particular state. I would assume that that organization would have to disclose where they got that money, who the original source was, the person who originally earned that money, or the business that originally earned that money through their legitimate business activities.
So before we move on to the next question, I have a question for Terry, and since we've heard a little bit about how compliance is handled in Maryland, would you talk about how how 211 became a law, and what is the compliance mechanism like in Arizona related to 211?
Well, first I have to respond to a little something Nancy said about how hard it is to get the legislature to act on things like this. Bear in mind, 211 was passed by 72% of the electorate. And again, as I said, I thought that was low. We never could get a legislative hearing on transparency, on disclosure. So I admire what you're trying to do in Virginia. I understand how hard it is, because if the only minority that favors hiding the source of funds happens to be the majority of your legislature, and in our case in Arizona, that's pretty much it, then that makes it really hard if you're not a state that has a direct initiative. Now, we were benefited by, and you may have heard, Arizona's a pretty conservative place. Virginia has some of that same reputation. We didn't want to set up a new organization. We didn't want to be tasked with not just requiring disclosure, but putting a new arm of government to do the policing. We were fortunate that a previous initiative had done a program called the Arizona Clean Elections Commission. The Clean Elections Commission was set up by initiative. The legislature never would have done it. They originally were a public funding agency. But the Supreme Court's decisions on public funding have made it difficult for them to continue in that mission. They still do some, but they only do public funding in districts which don't really have any competition. Because as soon as you get a competitive seat, all of a sudden people have to raise money outside of a public financing mechanism. It's unfortunate, but we had this organization already there. It had a great deal of credibility. Clean Elections Commission, I would defy you to find a better name for an enforcement group. And we gave them in our proposition the authority to hold hearings, to devise the various regulations, which are absolutely critical to enforcement and implementation of our proposition. And they have done that with a serious intent. I think they've done a great job. They've gone after folks who have tried to violate the statute. They have done some advisory opinions when there was any doubt at all about how to interpret the statute. That's been incredibly valuable. And I think their credibility has added a great deal to our disclosure process in Arizona.
Thank you very much, Terry. Beth, can I come back to you? One more time, would you give us an example of a state that has put in an effective compliance program that you're aware of? And as you've looked at all of these state laws, and is it an independent agency? Is it within a Department of Elections? Give us some idea of the structure.
There are a lot of different ways that states have done this. Obviously, we've heard from Maryland, which has a board of elections. There are certainly states that have independent agencies that they've set up. There are a lot of different approaches, but I would say we tend to say that an independent agency is often a really good way to think about doing this if states were doing it from whole cloth, because you can theoretically design it to be less influenced by, the political headwinds of the day compared to, say, some states where it's run by the Secretary of State, who may be elected or appointed and have other considerations as they're making enforcement decisions.
So ultimately, there is a comment in the chat here. As I think that most of you have come tonight because what your biggest concern is not so much whether or not a 501c4 is donating, but how do we get behind these billionaires and millionaires who are making these large donations in our state, and particularly in this election coming up. And so I'm going to go back to Alan and Jared here. Jared, you touched on this a little bit right at the beginning, that you were seeing this massive amounts of money that was coming in, and that was the impetus to make the change. But I mean, the change must have been incredibly hard. And could you and Alan give us and we have about 5 minutes left here, a practical result that you have seen because you've implemented these changes to your campaign finance system?
Well, I guess the practical result was, it's now disclosed, right? I mean, like when you come into the state of Maryland, what is going on is that, it's no longer dark money because it's going to be publicly disclosed in a timely fashion. And, we also review these reports if they're filed late or if they have activities on them that should have been disclosed earlier. We had one of our biggest fines, I think, was against the ballot initiative committee that was doing an independent expenditure and basically failed to disclose their reports in a timely fashion. And we ended up with like close to, I think, a $50,000 fine against that entity. Now it's, a couple of years later, but it still had an effect upon other individuals that want to come in and do independent expenditures. I see it from one of the comments here about like, billionaires and millionaires, they're not shy about contributing to IEs. I mean, this is I think the thing is this, you have the law and you have the Supreme Court. You have to, you're not going to stop a billionaire from donating or a millionaire from donating $10 million to make ads. But, I mean, that's right now, that is a constitutional right. And, you can't put limits on it, but what you can do is make sure that the public is aware. And having the public aware then knows like what, now they're making informed decisions as to how this person governs, because I think how money is spent and who gives money to candidates is a good reflection of how they will govern in the future. If you have public financing, which is a big option, right, it shows that you have a ground support and that, you have a lot of small dollar donors to you. And that translates into more of a people-based campaign. You have other ones that are, heavily financed by, other groups. And those groups there, almost every group is a special interest group. Whether you might not think your group is a special interest group, but everyone has an interest here. And having looking, a window into how, they're being financed is going to be how they're going to govern. And so I think that's kind of like the biggest thing here, which is the practical implications of all this is timely disclosure. And, we have a 48-hour reporting period, as Alan mentioned, and, failure to comply with that really shows that, you have to back that up with a good stick, because otherwise, if you don't, then it just, you have to understand, when you're spending, $25 million on ads, if the penalty is $250, that's nothing, right? Like it has to be, almost equal to what the ability of that group is spending and why they're spending on it. The other part too is making sure that you can go after them. We have a law that basically says that once they spend $50,000, they have to have a registered agent in the state of Maryland, so we can know where to serve a person in case there's any sort of legal action against that entity, so that we're not tracking down, outside the state, because I don't have process servers in, other states. It becomes those types of logistical or jurisdictional issues that come about.
And so we have a last question here, and I'll throw it open to anybody in the panel. Do the entities that air these ads, and I don't know if you have a law in Maryland or if you have a law in Arizona, have any responsibility for vetting the ad before it's put out there, and the people who are funding it?
That seems like that would have a very chilling effect about responsibilities or content-based restrictions. I think Elizabeth would be a part of that. I see she's agreeing with me on that one there, right? Like the last thing we want to do is get an ad that I have to review and look for content-based, any sort of what they say at that point there. I think, right. So yeah, we don't vet ads or what they say.
Well, actually, the question was, and I know we have a hard stop here for Beth, was whether the people who put out the ad have a responsibility to vet the ad and like, for example, in the Arizona law, who is funding the ad. So not the content, but by the state entity, but by the entity that's putting the ad forward.
Yeah, it's not content based in any way, but of course, the individuals that put it on the air are responsible for the content. And because of our disclosure statute, so are the people that contribute to that ad. So they buy into what they're saying. And there's some talk about the legal consequences. And I just need to quote my new favorite justice from the Supreme Court, and it's Anthony Scalia, who basically said in no uncertain terms, he did not want to ever be part of a Supreme Court that, because of their action, made it possible to campaign in secret. He was one of the great admirers of taking your lumps if you must, but being public about your opinion.
Well, and with that, we've come to the end of our hour. So I want to give anybody 10 seconds for a final word. Nancy, I'll start with you.
Sure, and thanks for everybody. I think this is a really complicated issue, but I do think there's an appetite for reform in Virginia, just because legislators are sick of being attacked by ads where they don't know where they're coming from. So I think that they recognize it's good. It's good for legislators. It's good for voters, and maybe donors. But anyway, I think there's a further discussion, and I would love to have Terry. The issue is on the thresholds and trying to protect nonprofits who are just doing their business and trying to avoid harm while attacking big money. So I do think I want to thank you. I think that we've already found a champion who's going to reintroduce her disclosure bill. Probably she's in the Virginia Senate. We'll try to find one in the House. Hopefully avoiding the ACLU attack. I think maybe the ACLU thing you can get around by not forcing them to disclose all of their donors. Anyway, what we hope to do is to use your expertise, and I know Elizabeth has always been wonderful about this, about getting a bill and having it reviewed by experts in other states, and also the Campaign Legal Center, so that it not only respects the spirit of law, but best practices around states. So I just want to thank you guys for a wonderful discussion and for making yourself available.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Disclosing all the
everyone.
donors has never been an issue with us. I mean, we just focus on the ones who want their money used for campaign ads, period.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I mean, Jarrett, I don't know if you have any final recommendations or Terry, guidance to leave us with.
No, just good luck. Yeah,
Yeah,
always.
good luck. And I'm so happy I got in Justice Scalia because this is not a partisan issue. This is one that has conservatives and liberals absolutely united that we need to have full disclosure.
Yeah, and we did surveys and 88% of Virginians support total disclosure. It's just, again, I wish we were a ballot initiative state. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
You
Have
too.
a good night.
Bye.
Bye.